It didn't make headlines right away. It wasn't some dramatic political clash. Instead, it was a quiet decision, a single bureaucratic move that flipped the entire agricultural machinery industry on its head. John Deere, the legendary icon of American farming, suddenly found itself paralyzed. Factories went silent. Dealers were left with empty showrooms. Farmers were stuck waiting for parts that never arrived. Canada didn't need force or threats. They simply changed the rules, introducing a layer of logistics so complex that it choked the flow of essential components. And while John Deere was struggling to breathe, global competitors moved in fast, seizing the moment with ruthless efficiency. No one saw it coming. Not Deere, not Washington, not the American farmers now left scrambling. Why did Canada use bureaucracy as a weapon? How did China and South Korea turn this chaos into an opportunity? And what does it mean for American farming when its most trusted brand starts to falter? What's happening? It wasn't an economic downturn. It was a chokehold on production. As the parts shortage spread from factory to factory, John Deere found itself in an unprecedented crisis. The ripple effect began in Iowa, where the first production halt caught workers and managers off guard. As the reality sank in, it became clear that this was not an isolated incident. Soon, factories in Illinois, Missouri, and Kansas reported similar stoppages. The heart of America's agricultural machinery production was grinding to a halt. Workers arrived at their shifts to find production lines eerily quiet. Managers, trying to keep morale up, explained that the delays were temporary. But days passed, and the parts never came. Confusion gave way to anger. Many employees had dedicated decades to the company and couldn't understand why production had suddenly ceased. Rumors spread about layoffs, while some feared the entire operation might shut down for good. John Deere had always prided itself on its ability to adapt, but this time, adaptation seemed impossible. The company had no contingency plan for a prolonged border delay, especially not during peak production season. Workers were left in limbo, unsure if they would be called back or if their jobs were permanently lost. Families, who had relied on steady paychecks, found themselves calculating how long they could survive without income. Efforts to source parts from alternative suppliers failed miserably. The specialized components that Deere needed couldn't be easily replicated or sourced locally, even if they could find alternative manufacturers. Ramping up production would take months. Deere's reliance on Canadian suppliers had been seen as a strategic choice, until the border delays made that strategy a liability. As the days stretched on, some factories started dismantling partially assembled machines just to free up space on the factory floor. This was no longer just a delay. It was a full-scale manufacturing meltdown. Workers began to realize that this wasn't just a temporary hiccup, but a systemic failure. Their faith in the company began to wane, and whispers of job losses became more frequent. By the end of the first month, layoffs began. Hundreds of workers were sent home with the promise that they might be called back once the parts arrived. But deep down, many knew that their jobs might never return. Morale plummeted. For the first time in decades, John Deere looked vulnerable. And just when Deere thought the worst was over, the fallout reached the dealerships. As factories went silent, dealers faced an even more chaotic reality: dealer desperation, a crisis of trust in rural America. In farming towns, John Deere was more than just a brand. It was a lifeline, until it wasn't. As factory shutdowns continued, dealerships across the Midwest faced a crisis of their own. Farmers flocked to local dealers, desperate for parts to fix their aging equipment. But shelves were bare. Dealers once proud representatives of the John Deere legacy, found themselves delivering bad news to loyal customers. Farmers needed their machines operational to maintain their crops, and every day of delay meant financial loss. Some had already pre-ordered new models or parts, only to be told that their shipments were indefinitely delayed. In tight-knit communities, this felt like a betrayal. Trust in the iconic green and yellow began to wane. Dealers tried to explain the situation, but without clear communication from corporate, they had few answers. Financial strain began to build as sales plummeted. Some dealerships considered stocking competitor brands just to keep their businesses alive. Longtime customers, once staunchly loyal to Deere, began to explore alternatives. The emotional impact was profound. Farmers felt abandoned, while dealers felt powerless. Decades of loyalty were being eroded, not just by logistics, but by a perceived lack of accountability from John Deere. It wasn't just business, it was personal. As rural loyalty faltered, Canada's strategic chess game continued. We've done the research, dug into the policy shifts, and followed the trail of economic fallout just to give you the most comprehensive breakdown of how Canada's strategic move left John Deere scrambling. If you appreciate deep dives like this, make sure to like and subscribe. Canada's masterstroke, the strategic trap that Deere never saw coming. While John Deere scrambled, Canada tightened the noose without breaking a single law. This wasn't just disruption. It was long-term dominance disguised as policy. Canada's logistical strategy wasn't just about slowing down production. It was about forcing American companies to rethink their entire operational strategy. Mark Carney's calculated move was aimed at one thing: pushing U.S. companies to localize production. By choking the supply chain at a crucial moment, Canada ensured that companies like John Deere would have to consider building more factories domestically or face the same crisis again. The political framing was crucial. Canada appeared strategic and methodical, while the U.S. seemed reactive. The real aim was clear: make American reliance on foreign manufacturing unappealing. But as Deere struggled to adapt, a new threat emerged, not from abroad, but from within the United States. Farmers abandoned. The dealers have nothing left to offer. For farmers, loyalty is a way of life until the machines stop working. In small farming communities, John Deere is more than just a brand. It is a symbol of reliability, a trusted partner in every planting and harvest. So, when machinery started breaking down and parts were nowhere to be found, the frustration turned to outright panic. Farmers rely on their tractors, balers, and combine harvesters to keep their operations running smoothly. Yet, as the supply chain chaos continued, essential parts simply stopped arriving. Dealers, who had long built their reputations on having the right part at the right time, were left empty-handed. Showrooms, once filled with gleaming new models, now felt hollow, as if the very soul of the business had been ripped out. Dealers across the Midwest reported the same issues: engines without pistons, hydraulic systems without pumps, and digital consoles that couldn't be updated because the necessary modules were stuck somewhere across the Canadian border. Farmers, already struggling with unpredictable weather and rising input costs, now faced a new crisis: machinery that could not be repaired. In rural Nebraska, one dealership owner summed up the situation grimly. "We have the showroom, we have the brand, but we've got nothing to sell. It's like being a bank with no money." Farmers, some of whom had been loyal to John Deere for generations, started exploring other brands, often reluctantly. Some farmers began scouring online forums and classifieds, looking for used parts or equipment from non-Deere brands. Others started to consider switching to foreign manufacturers, despite their deep loyalty. For many, it felt like betraying a family tradition, but survival came first. As one Kansas farmer put it, "I bled green for 30 years." But loyalty doesn't fix a broken planter in spring. The impact on local dealerships was catastrophic. Customers, who had put down deposits months in advance, started pulling out. Others went to neighboring counties or states, hoping to find a dealer that still had inventory. Reputations built over decades crumbled as dealers struggled to explain why they couldn't meet demand. And as farmers looked elsewhere, a new wave of competition swept in from overseas. The foreign invasion, China and Europe seized the market. As John Deere faltered, foreign manufacturers moved in like a tide, silent, steady, unstoppable. While John Deere scrambled to recover, manufacturers from China and Europe moved quickly to fill the void. Brands like BYD and Kubota, which had long struggled to gain a foothold in the American heartland, suddenly found themselves in high demand. They offered what John Deere couldn't: availability, affordability, and functioning machinery. Chinese companies were particularly agile. As American farmers grew desperate, BYD tractors began appearing in rural showrooms. European brands like Claas and Fendt, traditionally known for high quality but niche products, expanded their American presence, offering reliable alternatives that farmers could actually purchase and maintain. The reasons were simple. These companies had the parts and production capacity that Deere had lost. As one Oklahoma dealer put it, "Farmers aren't picky when their crops are dying. They need machines that work." The loyalty once reserved for John Deere started shifting toward practicality. Farmers, who would have once scoffed at foreign-made equipment, now found themselves writing checks for Chinese and European models. And it wasn't just about desperation. The new machines were modern, efficient, and came with service guarantees. In some cases, they even offered features Deere had yet to implement. While foreign brands claimed territory, U.S. states decided to take matters into their own hands. The states rebel. When governors defy Washington, when Washington fails, the states rise. And that's exactly what happened. With Washington seemingly paralyzed and American manufacturers in chaos, state governors took the lead. The Midwest, home to countless farms and factories, couldn't afford to wait for federal intervention. Governors from Michigan, Iowa, and Ohio reached out directly to Canadian trade officials. Their goal was simple: find a way to keep parts flowing. The irony was striking. These were states that had voted overwhelmingly for Trump, drawn to his promise of restoring American industry. Now, they were negotiating behind his back to protect their economies. These governors weren't just asking, they were pleading, pointing out that without relief, entire communities would collapse. As states broke ranks, some sought partnerships with foreign manufacturers to build plants locally, bypassing the tariffs altogether. It wasn't just pragmatic, it was survival. While Washington continued to talk about trade wars and tariffs, state leaders were building alliances to save jobs. But as states fought back, the global landscape of agriculture was already shifting. America's economic dilemma: jobs, trade, and political fallout. When jobs vanish and imports surge, even loyal voters start questioning their choices. The collapse of John Deere's production did not just disrupt supply chains, it sent shockwaves through the entire Midwest. Communities built around factories found themselves facing unprecedented unemployment. In towns where green and yellow had dominated the landscape, The absence of factory work was more than just a loss of income. It was a loss of identity. As layoffs mounted, the political landscape began to shift. Voters who had staunchly supported Trump's aggressive trade policies were now questioning their wisdom. The very policies, intended to protect American manufacturing, seemed to have backfired spectacularly. Retaliatory tariffs, aimed at bolstering domestic production, instead crippled the most iconic American agricultural brand. Local economies were hit hard. Cafes near the factories closed early, as fewer workers meant fewer customers. Small businesses that relied on agricultural spending saw sales plummet. Communities that had once thrived on the stability Deere provided were now grappling with the reality of economic stagnation. Anger, once directed at Canada for the initial disruptions, slowly shifted toward Washington. Farmers and workers felt betrayed by a government that had promised economic revival but delivered uncertainty. Grassroots movements began forming, demanding that the administration address the growing crisis. Rural politicians, once vocal supporters of the tariffs, found themselves dodging questions at town halls. The trade strategy itself appeared fundamentally flawed. While the tariffs were supposed to protect American jobs, they inadvertently made it more cost-effective for companies to relocate production abroad. Ironically, even Deere had explored shifting some manufacturing outside the United States to avoid the financial burden. As the heartland felt the pressure, frustration brewed, leading to public demonstrations and community meetings where local leaders struggled to provide answers. Amidst this growing tension, a surprising narrative emerged, a push from voters demanding pragmatic solutions rather than partisan rhetoric. Rural communities began advocating for new policies that would protect their livelihoods without sacrificing trade relationships. The once solid political ground beneath nationalist rhetoric started to crumble, revealing a more nuanced demand for economic stability over ideological purity. But as the heartland felt the pressure, a new force was quietly gaining momentum on U.S. soil. Amid the chaos, unexpected alliances were forming within the United States. Corporate desperation, Deere's belated gamble. When your back is against the wall, every decision feels like a gamble. For Deere, it was too little, too late. John Deere's leadership, realizing the severity of their crisis, hastily announced plans to increase local manufacturing. Retrofitting existing plants in Iowa and Illinois became a priority. However, the costs were astronomical, and the speed with which Deere attempted the transition led to logistical nightmares. As workers were rehired, confusion reigned. Machines that had been idle for months now needed costly upgrades. Parts suppliers, many of whom had already shifted their focus to foreign brands, were reluctant to resume contracts. The company's delayed response not only drained financial resources, but also damaged what little trust remained. Investors were losing faith. The company's stock, once a pillar of industrial stability, continued to slide. Board members were increasingly vocal about the company's lack of foresight and poor crisis management. The gamble to boost domestic production seemed less a strategy and more a desperate grasp for relevance. As Deere's crisis deepened, other nations began to see opportunity in America's industrial chaos. Japan's strategic reassessment, a nation under pressure. When your biggest export market becomes your biggest problem, it's time to rethink your strategy. Japan's relationship with the United States has always been defined by economic interdependence. For decades, Japanese automakers like Toyota and Honda have relied on the vast American market to drive their global success. However, the recent wave of tariffs has shattered this equilibrium. As the United States aggressively targets imports, Japan finds itself facing an existential crisis. How do you protect an industry when your biggest customer becomes your biggest adversary? The Japanese government, caught between safeguarding its automotive sector and maintaining diplomatic ties with Washington, is scrambling to respond. Officials have convened emergency meetings with top executives from Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and other major manufacturers. The goal: to develop a strategy that mitigates the financial hit while preserving Japan's automotive dominance. Some lawmakers have suggested imposing retaliatory tariffs on American goods, but the risk of escalating the trade conflict has kept such ideas in check. Instead, the focus is on shoring up domestic production to minimize reliance on the American market. Automakers are pursuing two primary strategies. The first is localized production, shifting more manufacturing to the United States to avoid tariff impacts. Toyota, for example, has accelerated plans to expand its plant in Kentucky, hoping to boost local output by 20% within 3 years. Honda is considering similar moves, including building a new facility in Ohio specifically for electric vehicle production. The second strategy is diversification, aiming to reduce dependency on American consumers by increasing exports to Southeast Asia and Europe. This dual approach may mitigate immediate damage, but it also reflects a harsh reality. Japan's automotive industry must evolve or risk obsolescence. Public sentiment in Japan is rapidly shifting from frustration to anger. Initially, many viewed the tariffs as just another skirmish in the ever-volatile world of global trade. Now, however, the impact on jobs and production is becoming evident. Japanese workers who build vehicles intended for American consumers are worried about job security, and some unions are calling for stronger government intervention. Protests outside government offices have become common, with citizens demanding policies that protect local workers rather than appease American trade demands. But as Japan scrambles to adapt, other Asian giants are quietly celebrating. China and South Korea, unexpected winners. While Japan is reeling from the tariff shock, China and South Korea are stepping into the gap with calculated precision. These two countries, long perceived as manufacturing powerhouses, are now poised to become dominant players in the American automotive market. As Japanese brands struggle to navigate the new landscape, Chinese and South Korean automakers are seizing the moment to expand their influence. Leading the charge are companies like BYD and NIO, both of which have been aggressively expanding their presence in the United States, seizing on the void left by Japanese manufacturers. BYD has announced plans to open 2 new assembly plants in Texas and California, focusing on affordable electric vehicles. Meanwhile, NIO is partnering with local dealerships to increase its network coverage, offering incentives to dealers willing to stock their models. The strategy is simple: flood the market with affordable, reliable electric vehicles at a time when traditional manufacturers are still adapting to new regulations. South Korea, meanwhile, has taken a more conservative but equally strategic approach. Hyundai, already a significant player in the American market, is ramping up production at its Alabama and Georgia plants. The company is also fast-tracking the introduction of its new electric crossover, aiming to appeal to environmentally conscious consumers looking for alternatives to traditional brands. By maintaining a strong production base in the United States, Hyundai avoids the tariff pitfalls that have ensnared its Japanese counterparts. What makes China and South Korea's strategy so effective is their agility. Rather than resisting the tariff changes, they are leveraging them. by investing in localized production and forming partnerships with American suppliers. They are positioning themselves as resilient and adaptable. This approach not only strengthens their economic footprint, but also builds brand loyalty among American consumers disillusioned by price hikes from established manufacturers. But while Asia adapts, Europe is facing a crisis of its own. Unlike their agile Asian counterparts, European luxury brands are trapped in a strategic quandary that could redefine their position in the global market. Europe faces a dilemma that could reshape its luxury market. Europe's shockwave, luxury brands caught in the crossfire. Mercedes and BMW didn't just lose customers, they lost their entire pricing strategy. European automakers have long enjoyed a prestigious position in the American market. Brands like Mercedes, BMW, and Audi symbolize luxury, performance, and engineering excellence. Yet the tariffs have disrupted their entire business model, forcing them to reassess not just pricing, but their very identity. Unlike mass-market brands, luxury automakers cannot simply move production to avoid tariffs. Their business model relies on high-quality European-made components and meticulously controlled manufacturing processes. Relocating production to the United States would compromise the very essence of their brand. Yet, absorbing the cost of tariffs risks pricing their vehicles out of the market. Mercedes, for instance, faces an estimated cost increase of 15% per vehicle, pushing even entry-level models out of reach for many consumers. In response, some brands are considering a drastic move, scaling back American operations entirely. BMW is evaluating the feasibility of reducing its model lineup in the United States, focusing only on high-margin vehicles. Audi, meanwhile, is offering more flexible leasing options to absorb some of the cost increases without fully passing them on to consumers. The real dilemma, however, lies in maintaining brand value. If European automakers opt for local production, they risk diluting the perceived quality that justifies their premium prices. On the other hand, maintaining the status quo risks market irrelevance as American consumers shift to more affordable alternatives from Asia. And while Europe grapples with reality, Detroit is eyeing a comeback. Once left for dead in the global automotive race, American automakers are sensing an opportunity to reclaim their home turf. As Europe struggles, American automakers sense an unexpected opportunity. The new normal, reimagining the automotive world. What if the automotive industry as we know it is gone for good? The tariffs have not just shaken the automotive industry, they have reshaped it. What began as a targeted economic move has now spiraled into a complete realignment of global manufacturing. As the dust settles, one thing is clear: the auto industry will never be the same. One major shift is the rise of American-made electric vehicles, with tariffs pushing the cost of imported cars sky high. American manufacturers are doubling down on localized production. Companies like Ford and General Motors are pouring billions into electric vehicle factories, betting that consumers will prefer locally built cars over expensive imports. Consumer preferences are also shifting. As imported vehicles become pricier, there is a growing sense of pride in buying American. What was once a symbolic gesture is now an economic necessity. For the first time in decades, local brands are competing not just on nostalgia, but on practicality and affordability. One thing is certain: the auto industry has changed forever, and the road ahead is uncertain. As the dust settles, the new world order in agriculture and manufacturing becomes clear. If this story left you questioning the future of American manufacturing? Let us know in the comments. How do you think John Deere will recover? And what does this mean for rural America? Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth stories like this. We're keeping our eyes on every twist and turn so you don't have to.